let me ask a question. How many are from the... it's on. How many of you are from the boomer generation, or believe you are? Okay, this is your panel. You lived through it. How many of you are from the, let's say, the generation X? Oh. You were born when these panelists were doing their job and developing the mole program. So, and I won't ask about the rest of the generations. As a preliminary, let me just say the National Reconnaissance Office is one of the major intelligence organizations and is responsible for the collection of intelligence at the national level, essentially from space today. And back in the Cold War, that was a different environment. You would not have heard someone admit that they were at the National Reconnaissance Office. In fact, all of these individuals who were on the crew and in the program were told, don't talk to the press, don't talk to the public, because this is a deep secret. And the National Reconnaissance Office is in the process, and tomorrow on the webpage, and for those of you who are here, when you leave, there's a compendium of the documents that have been declassified. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But I've asked our panelists to have a conversation among themselves. I have some seed questions to start them off. But let me just give you their names. You can identify who they are. I'll go in alphabetical order. And they're not sitting in alphabetical order. They never were to follow there's Colonel Carol Bobko. There's Colonel Al Cruz. Captain Bob Crippen. Vice Admiral Richard Truly, and Dr. Michael Yamarovich. So here you have the technical director for the program and the astronauts who were in the program. There are several astronauts who are not with us tonight for a variety of reasons. And I think Admiral Truly might want to make note of that.
Yes, thank you. Is this on? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, there are only 4 of us here, but there were a total of 15 crew selected for the program at one time or another. And I just thought I would go quick. We decided that we would start off by going quickly through the names. And since at the time I was the junior officer in the group, I was chosen. Mike Adams later left the program and later killed in X-15. Al Cruz is here. Jack Finley left the program in the 60s, made 6 tours on Yankee Stadium to Vietnam. Dick Lawyer, U.S. Air Force, is deceased. Mac McClay lives in Colorado Springs, and I'm not sure about this, but I think perhaps some of Mac's family is here, and if you are, I'd like to meet you. Greg Newbeck lives in Florida. Jim Taylor, after the program was killed in a T-38. Myself. Both Bob Coe and Bob Crippen are here. Hank Hartsfield, U.S. Air Force, flew several shuttle flights, deceased. Gordo Fullerton also flew shuttle flights and was a heavy airplane test pilot at Dryden at Edwards. Bob Overmeyer, U.S. Marine Corps, killed testing a light airplane. Jim Abramson, later a lieutenant general and program director of Star Wars at the SDI program. Bob Harries, retired as a four-star general, first vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and later chairman of USAA. Bob Lawrence, killed in a F-104, was the first African-American astronaut at either NASA or in the military. And Don Peterson, who couldn't be here tonight. But we just wanted to make sure you knew that there was a lot more than us in the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dick, you mentioned some of the people and what they did, but you didn't talk about your own things after you left the program.
You're right.
I told you they didn't follow the rules. Before we get started, and we'll come back to that question. Before we get started, I want to make two comments and then ask the NRO historian to kind of set the stage so that we're all on the common script. Some may wonder, why are we discussing the Dorian program, the NRO's Dorian program, when it never became operational? Well, the fact is that, yes, it did not become operational, but it was an investment by the National Reconnaissance Office and the intelligence community and the Department of Defense in a technology program that had spin-offs in space as well as in national reconnaissance. A lot of the future NRO activities are really dependent and derived from the technologies that this program developed. But probably more important is the investment in the people. And you heard the names of all of the astronauts. There were others that were involved in the program also that developed experience, gained insight, and later in their career, it paid off. And that's where we're going to have to come back to you, Admiral Truly, to kind of at some point share with us. You're not going to escape that. But before we turn to the panel, it's probably helpful for the NRO historian to give you a quick summary and overview of the historical context of what we're talking about. James?
Well, good evening. It's great to be with you this evening, and I know the focus is really to listen to these fine gentlemen. But I want to give just a very brief historical overview of what was going on that allowed us to get here. Time often allows for facts to be distorted or forgotten. But history allows us the opportunity to rediscover and recover facts. And that's what we're going to attempt to do tonight as we talk about the legacy of this particular program and the contributions that it made. It was born in an environment where we had multiple challenges, one of which was the set of challenges that came from the Cold War. We lived in an era where, or this program grew in an era where there were vast parts of the world that we just could not obtain information about what our adversaries were up to. We had little or no access, not maps, not telephone books, no cell phones, no internet, and no ability in many ways to understand what those adversaries were up to. It was an era where the stakes had increased dramatically because of the atomic and later thermonuclear threats that emerged with the advent of our adversaries, the Soviet Union and others, having thermonuclear weapons. We had an inability to understand what we in intelligence call leadership intentions. What were our adversaries up to? We could not easily see what was occurring in the country that would give us indicators of what they were up to. And there was a kind of competition of the highest consequences, a competition of ideologies. Should we continue in the direction that we had continued traditionally in this country, or should we take a new direction, sort of a legacy that came out of the 1930s? Also, there was a healthy exuberance for space exploration and exploitation. Manned space flight was the new frontier, the new horizon for us to move forward, kind of a continuation of our manifest destiny that we had declared many, many decades earlier. There was a race to be the first to the moon, an extension of this competition. Could we get there? There was a recognition that space could be used as a vantage point, a new way to find out information, a new way to continue to defend the interests of the country, and a new vantage point to allow the country to continue to thrive. And then there was a question of how do we defend this vantage point to assure that we were not put at a national strategy disadvantage. It was an era of tremendous emerging technologies, communications, faster, better, cheaper. We hear that quite often today, but we really see the emergence of communications technology and an emphasis on this. Space, for the first time, becomes critical for the advancement of our ability as humans, and we've been trying to communicate as humans ever since our advent. Space, for the first time, became critical for further advancement of communication. Optics, the ability to not only see but capture that world around us. Developments in material sciences that allowed us to have much, much more dramatic improvements in the ability to have optics. Electronics and computing, we were moving into a miniaturized world where we could compute faster, we could process faster, we could obtain information in a much, much more sophisticated fashion. And then finally, an extension of technology as a defensive resource. How do we use this to assure that we continue to advance as a nation? And there's a fourth area where we saw historical challenges and changes occurring, and that was in our societal changes. Vietnam, of course, emerges from the 1960s as the predominant societal change. But as history goes back and reflects on it, it emerges towards the end of that decade, with so much occurring earlier in the decade before Vietnam shaped perceptions of the change. There's always a question of, did we begin to reject traditional values? Maybe so, maybe not, but we continue to seek after that ability to defend the nation. Equality emerges as a predominant value of change. And finally, demographics. For the first time, those baby boomers that Dr. MacDonald identified amongst you, you emerge into society and have an opportunity to shape your own destiny. In many ways, the manned orbiting laboratory is consistent with the intrinsic American desire to expand our horizons. This is juxtaposed against an environment where we have a most pressing threat to American interests, but also the most abundant means to continue to defend the nation and protect the nation's interests. And it's against this backdrop that these gentlemen agreed to participate in this tremendous program. And we hope that we will be able to reveal a little bit more tonight about the facts of that program and allow us to recapture those facts that surround them. So back over to you, Bob.
Thank you. We can begin our discussion, but as I pointed out, the astronauts are always full of surprises, and General Abramson has joined us at the table. To kind of start us off, we all know that the Air Force leadership at the time were looking for the best, the brightest, the most experienced. And that's how they selected you. If each of you could say a little bit about how you came to be a part of the program, and then what did the experience of the program lead to in the rest of your career? So, who wants to start?
Well, I'll go ahead and pick it up, Bob.
Thank you.
I was attending, I was one of the Navy pilots that got lost and ended up at the Air Force Test Pilot School out at Edwards Air Force Base. And while I was a student there, both NASA and the Air Force, or the military, announced that they wanted to select some more astronauts. Well, just prior to that, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory first crew, containing Richard Truly and Al Cruz over here, had been announced. So I was aware of the program, although I knew it was very classified. But even though it was mostly an Air Force program, they called it a Department of Defense program, and they included a few of us Navy guys and eventually even one Marine. I wanted to get in one of them, so I applied for both, and eventually I'm working my way down the selection. The Navy told me I had to pick one or the other. This was in 1965, and we hadn't even got to the moon yet. We were in the Gemini program, but you could tell things were going to be tight, and I figured NASA had more astronauts than they knew what to do with, so I figured, well, my best chance of flying is to go with the military program. So I elected to go with MOL and was fortunate enough to be selected on that. Richard?
And then after the program?
Well, after... It got canceled on June 10th of 1969, a date that will live in my memory for a long time, which was one of the low points in my life. But one thing led to another, and my friend Bo Bobko down here asked, why don't we ask if NASA can use any of us? We poo-pooed the idea, but you learn you don't always know the answer, and one thing led to another, and NASA made a decision. A gentleman by the name of George Miller, and George just passed away this week. He's 97 years old. He was the AA for the Office of Spaceflight. He ended up telling Deke Slayton, you got to pick some of them, even though Deke didn't want any of us. And he made an arbitrary decision to say, okay, I'll take everybody 35 and younger, and I ended up on the lucky side of that.
Well, my story is not dissimilar to Cripp's. I was a Navy pilot along with Jack Finley in test pilot school. Chuck Yeager was the commandant of the school. And toward the end of that year, we noticed that Yeager kept going to Washington, and we knew something was going on, but we didn't know what. And it turned out that they were having the first astronaut selection for MOL. And they didn't bother asking us if we wanted to be in the pot. There were only, I think, 85 graduates at the time of the Air Force's Aerospace Research Pilot School, and they just assumed that all those guys want to be an astronaut. And so they eventually narrowed it down to 15 people, and I was in that group. And then they later narrowed it down to 8. But then there wasn't a program. This was 1964. The program hadn't been funded yet. It took till the fall of the next year that we, and this is the only the second press conference in my life I've ever been to discussing MOL. But the reason I remember that day, it was my 28th birthday. And they announced the first 8, first group of 8. Al was the senior. And so I was in the program, and I never applied. And then with Cripp, on after Black Tuesday, when it was canceled, NASA took the 7 youngest, and I was the only one out of that original group that was still young enough to be the 7 youngest, so they took me, so I never applied again. So I'm the only person that has ever flown in space that never applied.
It's on? Okay. Is it? Okay, I'm not an astronaut. Didn't apply for it. Well, I did apply, but I didn't make it. Well, in the meantime, just get back in time a little bit. 1960, Gary Powers gets shot down. We have no way of looking behind the Iron Curtain. So, a year later, 61, NRO gets formed to take pictures. Well, the Apollo program gets started at that same time. Just imagine how things were going very quickly. In 1962, I get called to get into Washington. I was working for a company in the Northeast, an AFCO Corporation. How would you like to go and work with the Apollo program? Of course, Joe Shea invited me and made me assistant director of flight systems. And I was 28 years old. As a matter of fact, everybody else was that same age. The old man, Joe Shea, he was all of 33. And we were a whole bunch of young kids, full of enthusiasm, worked day and night, didn't sleep, and produced Apollo. Because we didn't know better that it couldn't be done. We just did it. And George Miller was the guiding light. He just passed away. But at the same time, while Apollo was being developed, lunar landing program. Well, we got to do something with this hardware. We got to do something about Earth orbit. And how about, in the meantime, Gemini keeps coming along. So why don't we figure out some tasks to do in Earth orbit? Apollo applications comes along, Gemini flights are coming along, and the Soviet Union is really, really getting to be a threat to us. So some of my friends here get asked to participate in this new classified program, and I get asked, just as a kid, one of the kids, to be the technical director of this program. In the deep third sub-basement of the Pentagon. Couldn't breathe the word that we are using now. As a matter of fact, I'm having hard times pronouncing it now. That's just built into the system. But we were doing something that's exciting and important. Not only were we now adding to the concept of manned spaceflight, which was the big thing in Apollo, but we are going to do also something very important for national security. We're going to go look behind the Iron Curtain. Nobody saw anything once the airplanes got shut down. So this got to be the most exciting place in your young life. Defend the nation while doing the exciting things of manned spaceflight. And that was the beginning.
Like I'm home. Okay. In case you hadn't noticed, I was the old man of the group, and I think I'm still the old man. And part of my job before we got selected for astronauts, I was working down at the test pilot school, and I flew with all these guys at least a little bit. And oh, I'm sorry. Hear me now? Well, anyway, I worked with them flying and couldn't tell them a hell of a lot because they were pretty good pilots. But occasionally I could find a little bit of a glitch they did, and I told it to them. And so, speaking of glitches, the Admiral just made a small glitch because he said we had 15 people, and we had 17. But he talked about all 17 of them. So that absolves it. I had one other good item on them. I was selected for the X-20 dinosaur program. I was the youngest guy on it. And then that program got caught by the politicians. And our program was going to live if President Kennedy had lived. But 14 days after he died, the program was canceled. And it's hard to believe you can learn enough technical stuff in that time to change a program. But we had a couple of people that didn't like it. We got on down, went to work at Los Angeles, and most each guy had a particular area he was responsible for, and they all followed each of them. And I was maybe I wasn't smart enough to do that, but I kind of watched over all the programs if I could, and I enjoyed it very much. And Admiral McDonald mentioned, sorry, when you get old, you lose your train of thought also. But I enjoyed working with the guys very much, and when the program canceled, then me and four other guys were too old, and I went to NASA as a non-astronaut, and felt bad a little while, but I got to worked in the engineering office when they selected the shuttle contractor. And then after that was done, I moved back to aircraft ops because I'd never had a non-flying job before. And I think I'm the only one of the group that worked for the government 50 years. And I enjoyed every bit of it.
I got into the program, at least myself mentally, quite a bit before the MOL was announced. I was at the Air Force Academy in the late 50s, and we had a lot of instructors who were our instructors, but not only were they our instructors, they were going to be taking over departments, so they were very experienced. And so during that time, they were saying man's future is in space, and that you guys are going to be astronauts. And the seed was planted in my mind. And so every time I had the opportunity of doing something that would take me closer to being in space, I always took it. And so when, like, the MOL was announced, that was just great. And, of course, wonderful when I got selected, and terrible when the program was canceled.
One, two, is that okay? Okay, thank you. First, a couple of comments. If you want to get somewhere on time, fly Air Force. Not one of the airlines, and at least not in this era.
Dave, you got a little closer on the mic.
No,
it's on.
Get this away.
Now?
No, that's better.
The second, I think that there's some things that kind of need to be explained, obviously. And this whole effort is a celebration, but also an act of declassification. Well, there were times that the press got interested in the manned orbiting laboratory, and they would call various people that had been associated with it, and they would say, we want to do some interviews. And I had one of those situations, so I said, I don't know what the classification status is. So I went to the NRO history office. I went to security offices all over the place, and nobody knew what the status of the clearances were at that point in time. And so I participated, much to the chagrin of this particular reporter, by saying, I can't comment on that. I can't comment on that. I can't comment on that. And he said, what can you say? And I said, it was great fun. Are we declassified now or not?
Yeah. It's all in here. The secret is out.
Terrific.
Although there are a few secrets that we're still retaining.
Well, I was part of the last group, and it was a great privilege for us as we went through several stages that were very highly competitive. But to imagine that some of us would be selected and join this terrific group of people, and four of us were, and we were absolutely thrilled. But we, just like the program was highly classified, nobody told us a whole bunch of things about this program. An example of that is that nobody said that this program is in deep competition with non-manned activities. And interestingly enough, those non-manned activities now have been declassified before the manned. That may have something to do with our performance here. I'm not sure. But unfortunately, when the program was canceled, I was 3 months past the deadline. So I was the youngest of the two oldest. Too old kind of situation. I went to NASA, I talked to everybody. I said, 3 months, surely you can slip this a little bit. And they said, well, there's a bunch of other guys that are just a little bit beyond that as well. So nobody would allow me to do that. But I did have the honor and the privilege of being asked later to take over on the second flight of the space shuttle and to be the associate administrator that was managing those next flights. And I learned some lessons, and lessons that might have made a difference in the manned orbiting laboratory from NASA. But one of the big lessons that we really learned in the manned orbiting laboratory, and that was we started to have a cost overrun. That's not surprising. Most of the programs, if they have any degree of risk or if they have any serious degree of challenging the kind of the edge of technology here, have such things happen. And the astronauts, all of us, had the privilege that the program manager at that time, General Blameyer, would come and talk to us and would say, what strategy should he, the program manager, take in the Congress and with the Air Force as they go by and try to deal with this overrun. And the first time it happened, we all overwhelmingly said, we are going to be operational the first crack out of the bag. And that caused then, that philosophy, the program to slip nearly a year. The next year, we had the same situation. We voted the same way, and the program strategy was that. And the lesson I learned, and have applied since in other programs, is if you can just get an empty tin can up there, do it. Because then you can build on it. And of course, that was the way that NASA went to the moon. That was the way they helped create the space shuttle and the International Space Station and all these wonderful things. But the strategy with the Congress was the biggest risk, not the technical challenge and not what we were going to do. And I will say that while the unmanned systems, for lots of reasons, the advance of technology did indeed win the race, there was part of the race that has never been fully examined, fully exploited, and that's that, and I'm not sure this was a formal selection criteria for the astronauts. We had a job to do there that was a mixture of human judgment being exercised at a speed and a rate and with importance at a level that has never been fully looked at in any experiment that I know about, where the humans are working with the machine and adding their ability to make things judgments about, in this case, targets. But to fully appreciate that, you have to read the book. So I urge everybody, read the book and understand the experiment and learn the lesson that I think we all learned, even if I was 3 months too old.
Now you see why I asked you about your generation. Very important. Even 3 months. The Dorian program was very typical of a National Reconnaissance Office program in that it was imaginative, it was challenging, it was new. Question for you is, what experiences, what recollections do you have that you might want to share on how you dealt with some of the more challenging things that you faced? What recollections? And while you're thinking of the answer and who's going to take it first, we might try to reduce the feedback. Is when you're not using the microphone, turn it off, and when you are using it, turn it on and hold it close, and we'll try to see if that reduces the feedback. So here we go. Share some of the memorable experiences that you had in preparing for and training to be astronauts in the MOLE program. What did you encounter? What was most memorable? Who wants to try first?
I'll try something. Is that on? It doesn't really get into the Dorian part of the program so much, but we were going to be the first humans flying on a vehicle using solid rockets. And that had never been done before. We were flying a Titan III that was modified, and the version was a Titan 3M. And the solid rockets had... You can't shut down a solid rocket. So if you had a problem with them, we had these blowout plugs up at the top of them that would come off to negate the thrust. And it left a very small window for the crew to abort in. And I sort of put together a simulation down at Chance Vought in Dallas where we were going through and bringing crew members in and flying that profile, putting malfunctions in, and seeing if we could get off in time, and everybody that we brought in could do it. So,
other memorable experiences in dealing with the challenge?
I would like to go right to the heart of the Dorian program with the challenge, and it's something that Abe mentioned. You know, you have to think about what we were trying to do. First of all, you have to put yourself in the 1960s as far as the threat and what Mike talked about, and the level of technology. No person owned a computer. Only governments owned computers or big companies that the government bought for them. And we were trying not just to design a computer program to do a job, but to figure out a very complex human interaction with the automated system that would have made it, we believed, and I still believe, it would have made it, particularly for a film system, it would have made it far better than it could be done strictly as an automated system. We would essentially never waste a film on cloud cover. We would make sure that we took a picture when there was something important to take a picture of, and every variation in between. It was a very complex problem that I believe we did solve, but only shortly before Black Tuesday, when after all the slips and cost overruns and other things going on, cancel the program. But it was it was not a trivial thing that we were working on, and frankly, I don't know how that later played into any advancements in later programs, but it was a challenge to us. And we were all in our 20s, except for Al. He was in his 30s.
Well, I was 40 when it canceled. And so when you're that age, that was a big delta. And now, 40 years later, it's half as much a delta. But I lived through one cancellation, and I never did get over it. I'm still not over it. And then it didn't surprise me a lot when we started getting into money problems and all those kind of things. But I got the stories of what the unmanned system was doing at the time we were selected. And then I got the story of what the unmanned was doing about 2 years before we were canceled. And I was of the opinion that we weren't going to do a hell of a lot better than that. And I'd go around to visit contractors and see the nice new big buildings they were building, and other people would tell me we didn't have any money. So I assumed that all those buildings were going to support something else. And I don't know any facts about it, but I think that was true. But overall, I enjoyed the program very much.
No, I'm not supposed to give you that.
I was involved with what was talked about with the solid rocket motors because I was on the safety committee, and that was an interesting situation because we had they used what they called a pop-off. So the Gemini rockets fired into the void between the rockets in the laboratory and caused a pressure which then caused the Gemini to pop off so it wouldn't be exploded with the rest of the stack as it went by. So that was, and I think it was Dick who talked about it, or maybe Bob who talked about having having the simulation to do that. But there were a lot of things that I think are looked at with the shuttle as well, because the shuttle just like the MOL, did not have a capability to get away from those solid rocket motors. I think that's. I had worked on the flight control system and the propulsion system, and I felt that the astronaut duty was to be the operational-oriented person who was on the committee or on the group that was designing these things, to make sure that the crew operations were certainly thought about and talked about by everybody, to make sure the crew was adequately able to do what they were planning to do. Can't think of anything else.
Well, I'll just go back and add a little bit to this. As I think you can probably understand, it is really hard to suddenly slip out of all of this classification that's been built into your psyche for all these years, even though there are things that are absolutely inexplicable. Right near where these gentlemen work, there is this great big building, and it has a big sign in front of it that says the National Reconnaissance Office. And the first lesson that Al Cruz gave to me when we were brought in was, you never even use the initials NRO. So it is a little hard to adjust. But let me build on what you said. Imagine now a Soviet target was an airfield, maybe a place where they were doing flight testing. And that might have airplanes running up like you see here, or at operational bases doing ground testing, or airplanes getting ready to take off, specialized airplanes, or other kinds of specialized munitions being brought out on trucks and loaded under the aircraft. And if you have a camera that is not such high resolution, you can probably get a picture of the whole airbase. And then the analysts would really go after that and see what can they see. But if they didn't have the resolution, they couldn't make many of the kinds of measurements or the things that you really need to get to. So when the Manned Orbiting Laboratory began to build a camera, remember it's a film camera, but a camera that is going to be so precise that it's like looking down a soda straw, then the next question is, when you're coming over in orbit so fast, which of the things that are happening on that base do you want to make the picture of? Because you'll probably only be able to look at one, maybe two. And that was where the astronauts looking through less able systems were supposed to use judgment and training and to say, look here, not here. Don't waste the pass here. And when you're coming so fast, and you know that the speed of that camera maybe could only get 3 out of 8 or 10 targets that you wanted to look at, that was this task where we were going to try to add human judgment to this automated capability. And there are a lot of other places where human beings are doing interesting and testing and work. But I still, and maybe somebody else up here knows that, maybe some of the people from the NRO, but other places. But that was a real challenge. We couldn't even build a simulator right away that would allow you to test and train in that concept. And while each of us had special jobs, somehow or other I ended up with building that simulator as my responsibility so that we could all train. And I probably never looked through a telescope before in my life.
I have a question for Admiral Truly with regard to your survival training, and in particular in the water. Isn't there something about hand signals in survival training that you experienced?
Is he talking about when I almost drowned?
Maybe you could share that with us.
Well, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but it may be that when I almost drowned in water, or actually not drowned, we were down at Homestead in water survival, and we were in full pressure suits, and it's a long story, but a mistake was made. I take full responsibility for it, but I had the help of a suit tech in making that mistake. But there was a rubber dam around that had a zipper, and a little valve in the side of the helmet. And so basically, if the zipper was closed, the amount of volume in the helmet, when you tried to take a breath, if you were in a raft or something, it would open the valve. You would take a breath, you'd exhale, it would go out. If the zipper wasn't closed, you were breathing to the volume of the entire pressure suit, and it wasn't enough delta P to trigger the valve. At any rate, the zipper got in the water, the zipper wasn't closed, and I began to suffocate with a rescue boat maybe as close as the second or third row. And I thought I was going to die. And I started waving at the boat, and they waved back. And and also the mechanism on the faceplate was jammed, and I couldn't open the faceplate. At any rate, I lived, and but it's in all the flying I've ever come, that's as close as I ever came.
Richard, I've got a. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Comment. I was supposed to be the boss of the outfit, and either I can't remember that long, or I was never told.
Well, Al, there's some discussion of whether that happened on MOL or happened on the space shuttle. I think it was on the shuttle, if I recall.
I thought it was too. But it still happened.
But speaking of drowning, I got to tell you about a survival trip that most of the crew took for jungle survival, where we all went down to Panama, where the Air Force had a jungle survival school. And the deal was they took you out in the middle of the jungle, gave you a little equipment like you would normally be carrying in our MOL Gemini thing if we'd actually had to bail out somewhere. And they toss you out in the jungle, and you survive for about a week. Al was our chief cook, if I remember. The only problem was somebody shot a toucan, and he made toucan soup, but he used the same pan to do coffee in the morning. And I'll tell you, that's the worst coffee ever. But
only had one can.
But we had one crew member, Hank Hartsfield, good friend who's no longer with us, that at that time he could not swim. And the way they took us out after the week out surviving was we all jumped in the river with our life rafts and what have you, and we floated down the river to this Indian village. The only problem was while we were in the river, they had this big rainstorm upstream, and the river rose about 10 feet while we were in it. And it was a torrent, and it was waterfalls, and it was really bad. And Hank went over this one waterfall, which we were all having problems with, getting tied into a whirlpool, and he didn't come up. He had one of the guards, or one of the guides down there was with him. He was supposed to be following, but he lost him. And Hank ended up coming up, thank God, about 100 yards downstream. He popped up, but I really thought we lost him. That's the only other terrible drowning incident that I can remember. Bo, you remember that?
In that same Chagres River episode,
right.
Gordon Fullerton and I were the two guys that each had a raft full of equipment. And so when we went through some of these whirlpools, everybody else went down underneath and then came up. We stayed on top around the whirlpool and went around and around. Finally, Gordo and I are both hanging on to the side of the rock wall, and Gordo says to me, he says, "I don't think this is survival practice anymore." So we looked around, and we saw this big dead limb out over the stream. So we climbed out over the dead limb, and just as we got to the end, the limb broke, put us right back through again. Finally, what we did was we cut the rafts loose and sent them downstream. And my understanding was when the two rafts came downstream without Gordo or Bo, everybody was wondering, what happened to those two guys? So that was the other Chagres trip, at least the one that I remember.
Any other memorable recollections at this point?
Our crew, and I won't point names, but we all had hammocks that were strung between the trees, and he started snoring on one end, and you could see the vibrations go all the way down.
I have one last question before we have a short break, and it was kind of touched on in some of your comments earlier, and this is about the security. It was, as we've said before, a highly protective security program. Caution not even to mention the words of the organization that I won't mention right now. How did you deal with the public aspect? Because Mole, there was a public story about Mole, but everything else was compartmented and protected. How did you deal with that in your daily lives? How did you deal with your family? How did you just deal with it?
Well, since I don't have any astronaut stories to tell, let me talk about this one. Well, first of all, you have to understand today is different. The world is different than it was then. It was really, really a national security situation. We were very, very concerned about the Soviet Union dropping bombs at us, atomic bombs. So security was paramount. Besides, we didn't know whether the Russians would really react to the presence of a man in space. So, as a matter of fact, if you think about it, NASA was born in the concept of being a civilian agency. There's no other agency in the world that has this uniqueness of being just civilian. Most agencies, certainly in the Soviet Union, they work together. So here, this is a civilian agency, and yet some of us who are now thinking about what we're going to do with Apollo after we get through the landings, we have some national security things to do. So how do we tell NASA, the NASA guys, hey, we're doing something secret? And then, of course, the smart guys say, well, by the way, why are you doing this stuff on the West Coast? What's wrong with building everything out of the Cape Canaveral? Well, as you know, there's a azimuth restrictions. If you want to overfly Canada, you can, but that was not a very cool thing to do. So we're going out of Vandenberg, go south, and all for polar orbits. The NASA guys, the scientists just couldn't figure it out. What are you doing? And so there was this question. Why are you going this? Well, we did this because we have to have bases on both sides of the United States, and somehow worked out. Well, so I had this privilege of being the technical director in the Pentagon, and so I actually, would you believe it or not, I was detailed to the MOL office as a civilian, while in the meantime, the Apollo program had brought in Sam Phillips and 60 other Air Force officers to help manage the Apollo program. Management was a big problem, and we needed this experience of systems engineers from the Air Force. Well, so General Schriever calls up that there was an agreement between McNamara and Webb, the so-called Webb-McNamara agreement, and it actually was written both directions. So there are 60 officers coming this way, and who comes the other way? So one guy was selected to go work the other way. So I'm carrying a NASA badge and getting into this third sub-basement of the Pentagon trying to figure out how to do security. And my job was extremely complicated. I have to go back and forth to the President's Scientific Advisory Committee, to the President, to NASA administrators, to all sorts of back. Of course, some of the very top guys were briefed into the programs, so that worked. But keeping that boundary between the very top management, and very few of them were killed, and the rest of them was a very difficult job. Management is actually, after Abe's point, management is the key feature that made us successful. George Miller, with his concept of all-up testing, just imagine the guts of putting the entire Saturn V together all at once and then lighting the fuse to the whole thing, all at once, not in stages. Werner von Braun was going berserk over that idea. We couldn't have made the schedule with that. So you have to take risks, but you have to know what you're doing. And so I'm always admiring those people who have the talent and the leadership abilities to pull it off, and rather than cover themselves with stacks and stacks of paper that gets us nowhere.
Bob, to your question, I'll also comment, we had contractors that when we went to visit, we certainly did not appear as military. We could not tell our wives or family where we were going. We would tell them we're going to be gone approximately so long. If you got an emergency or something like that, they could call our office and talk to the secretary or somebody there, and they could get in touch with us. But you didn't reveal the contractors we were dealing with at that time.
Any other observations on security?
It wasn't completely in the black. I mean, we did have press conferences. Our names were in the paper occasionally. Like I can remember that we had something, and I told my daughter that I was going to be flying in space, and that's what this paper article was. And then one of my neighbors came over to me a couple of days later and said, "You know what your daughter is telling the people?" So that I think made it a little harder because it wasn't completely black.
You were working in two worlds.
Yeah. If I were just going up to Samso every day to work, that would have been easier to explain. I'm going to Samso than when your face is in the paper and people ask you, "Well, what does this mean?" So I did it on a daily basis.
I had a few times family and other close friends ask me, so I would just tell them we're in a space program and we're not allowed to talk about ours. And NASA has a space program that's open, We can pretty much do things the same way they do. So watch them.
Any other last-minute observations on the security?
Thank you.
Okay. Time for part two. Part two will try to focus the questions on lessons that they learned either for their career development or for future programs. And I have as a starting question for each one of them to respond to, and we're going to try a different protocol with the microphone. Like any technical program, it's trial and error, and eventually you get there. They're going to use one microphone. We're going to leave it on so they can't share any more secrets. You'll hear everything. And they're going to pass the microphone up and down the line. They're going to keep it. How did those experiences shape your future career? Okay? What did you learn that influenced your behavior later in the career, and how did they shape your career, the lessons that you learned? So who's going to take it first? The microphone is in the middle.
Start at the end or this end or what?
You want you to start, Abe?
I'll tell you a story that is right. Right. All these technical geniuses here, and nobody knows how to use a microphone. Let's see. First of all, the dilemma with the classified side of this we've talked about, and keeping information quiet and not doing that. And if I contrast with that what I truly learned later at NASA running the space shuttle and working again with all these terrific people, I was in the middle of that when President Reagan announced that he had wanted to start a defense against ballistic missiles. And later on, I had the honor to be selected to be his first program director for that. Now, what lesson in all of this keeping everything quiet keeping everything mostly quiet, or the open method that NASA has used throughout the years in all of their programs. When I went over and was interviewed by President Reagan for that job, he was just a delight, and he spent most of the interview telling me what I was supposed to do. But at the end, I said, "Sir, I have learned at NASA and in other programs the importance of being sufficiently open so that you have real credibility in the media and in the other out with the public, the taxpayers. That's where it really counts. And this is going to be, I'm talking about SDI now, of course, that this is going to be one of the most difficult programs because, of course, it was so controversial. And I said that I propose, if you will agree, that we run this as open as is absolutely possible, except where it is necessary to keep it highly classified. And, of course, there were elements of that couldn't or shouldn't be talked about at all. And the President said, "That's perfect. That's exactly what I want you to do." And then he said, "And I want you to get out and talk about it. Because he said, if you don't talk about it right," he said, "I know," meaning him, Reagan, "I know exactly what I want and why the nation needs it. And if you don't talk about it, then I won't have a program, you won't have a program, and the nation won't have a program. So, yes, sir.
I think I learned a little about systems engineering and to make sure that there is communication, because to have a good system engineering activity, you need a lot of communications between people. That was a little more difficult in the MOL because things were restricted, as we've all said. And I try to take that into the things that we did with the shuttle, such as with the testing, et cetera, to make sure that we got the best product that we could.
I never got a real big job after I left, but I got a job that I loved, flying airplanes. But I did work 2 years before that in the shuttle engineering office and helped pick the shuttle design. And anyway, and probably not a nice thing to say, but I was kind of amazed at the work that was done in picking the program, and I realized a lot of things that go on. But the contractor that made the presentation that looked just like the shuttle that flew was a different contractor than the one they picked, and they picked the one that had no model at all, but I guess they had the right support financially and those kind of things, because they did a very good job with it.
I guess the question is the management challenges of dealing with this classified program. Of course, the NRO was opened before MOL, and the NRO was driven to do reconnaissance, taking pictures in a highly classified way. Now, you cannot really hide men in space. Of course, at first you do, but later on, when they start flying, you have this. So, how do you protect the security? The MOL program actually was both black and white. The things that we could do and talk about, we did. We just didn't use the code names. But the most sacred part of the whole thing was the camera, and that was totally managed in a separate way, with occasional dialogue between General Schriever and General Martin, which General Schriever was much more driven to an open Air Force that did things both classified and unclassified, whereas the CIA, obviously, by its own birthright, is secretive. So it was quite a challenge to do things, but we are very much mindful of the fact that we did a lot of things very much in the open. And the things that sit there in front, that gadget's been sitting on my desk for decades. So we could have talked about it, except what was inside. And so it was management is a big issue. General Schriever was a magician that made things happen in the Air Force with the ICBM program and carried on with the MOL. His counterpart, George Miller, really the genius who made Apollo happen. I'm quite convinced that if it weren't for George, we would have not made it to the moon, certainly not on the schedule. So these two guys worked together, and they both knew what they were doing. They were both supporting NASA on one hand, as public as possible, and yet they knew what we could do for national security. And so we can work it. The thing that made everything happen well is the minimal amount of paperwork. Nowadays, you're drowning in systems engineering documentation that's driving everybody crazy. And, of course, it protects you from responsibility. And these days, responsibility just was right there at the front of the leader. And he had to do it without paper, just with his personality and the good people that he's surrounding him. And that's the magic that somehow, I don't think nowadays we could put together the Apollo program again. We would have too many cooks, too many people asking questions, too many people having second thoughts, and most importantly, too many people going home at 5 o'clock. We were doing this, we were barely sleeping. We were dedicated. And this doesn't seem to happen these days.
This one is a tough one for me because I'm not sure I can, in my own career, I can point a cause and effect. But I will say this: when I was in my 20s when I joined MOL, and prior to that, I had been a fleet pilot along with Crip. And when the program was opened up to me, it was stunning. That it was almost magic that there could be a program so large, so complex, so expensive, that was being managed absolutely invisibly to the public. MOL, the few years that I was on MOL, I was introduced to some great leaders, both in Washington, who I didn't know as well as I did out in Los Angeles. And then when the program was canceled, those of us who went to NASA, were thrust into the opposite. NASA worked as hard to get publicity as the NRO in those days made sure that they didn't. And then I worked Apollo Skylab, Apollo Soyuz, and early shuttle. And then I left, and that was the first time that I was really thrust into what I would say senior leadership role, but I did. I was first commander of Naval Space Command. I was jerked out of that job at the Challenger accident, and I was responsible for the investigation and return to flight. Then I was NASA administrator, and I was comfortable by that time. I don't know where I got the lessons, but I was totally comfortable in those roles because of MOL and in some way the combination of the differences between the way MOL was run and the way NASA was run. I don't know what you learned from that, but that was the experience I had.
Well, they've all said it's on the similar tack, so I'll give you a couple of specifics. First, I was like Richard. I was 28 when I was selected for that program as a young kid, and I remember going to one contractor working on unclassified stuff. It was actually Douglas. They were building the workshop for this thing, and we were going over the nomenclature that we were going to use on the panels in the vehicle, and we had to. Because the words get long sometimes, you had to use some abbreviations. So myself and this employee from Boeing were sitting there arguing about what abbreviations for certain terminology. And he finally turned to me and he said, "Young man, this vehicle is going to spend a lot more time on the ground in tests than it is in flight, so it ought to be my way instead of your way. But but he finally came around to see the light. That was it. And there was the other part. We as crewmen worked with the contractors, but we didn't have any direction authority. We weren't the program managers. We couldn't write out a change order. But you had to work with them to get things such that the crew could use it. And that learning that process served me well later in life and in various places. The other part that I learned is that it gets done by the people doing the job. Management is extremely important, but the people bending the hardware, doing the designs, those are the people that make it happen. And you have to pay attention to them. And if they've got something to say, you need to hear it, whether it's bad news or good news. And I use that fact a lot later in life.
Let's explore the question of industry-government interaction. You just mentioned a little bit about it. It seems that the MOLE and the Dorian program required a lot of dialogue with industry, and government industry had to be talking effectively. How do you see the MOLE experience shaping later interactions between government and industry in the space and reconnaissance area?
I'm not sure. Ask the question again, Bob. I'm not sure.
The big thing I noted was when I first got on MOL, and I don't remember seeing it at all when I was on Dinosaur, but on MOL they had each contractor had a large group of people. One of them was engineering, and another one was manufacturing, and then, anyway, and each one of them had a lot of people working for them. When General Blaymeyer came and took over our program, he decided that the unit that was mostly psychologists and psychiatrists didn't need to be working because the other people could do the job. And he just got rid of them. And it wasn't very long that NASA did the same thing. And I don't know if that part of the industry has recovered yet or not.
My question was, the program required a lot of collaboration with industry. How did the experience and the insight from the dialogue that took place in the MOLE program, how do you think that may have shaped the future interactions between government and industry in the business? Or did it not?
It certainly, at least from our standpoint, I'm not sure I'm following you exactly, Bob, but from our standpoint, we really didn't go work reconnaissance programs after MOL was canceled. So I'm not sure how it influenced that. It did give us the experience to deal with the contractors, like on Skylab. I went to work directly on Skylab after MOL was canceled, and the same contractor, Douglas, was doing the workshop. We were using the same computer that we were going to be using on MOL. In fact, I think the potty was the same potty. So that experience carried well over. I knew what we were working. But at least it taught me the proper ways to work with the contractor as a crew person, which is not the same as being in the program office. It is different. John Young and I, before we flew that first flight, we went around to every contractor, touched as many hands as we could to let them know that our butts were going to be tied on that thing, and we wanted it to work. And it worked.
Any other observations on that? Let me ask a final question in this phase. Working on the program, what was your greatest surprise? The thing that you did not anticipate, that you had to encounter, and how did you deal with that surprise? Each one of you faced some surprise that you did not expect. What was that, and how did you deal with it?
My greatest surprise was that it existed. I mean, no kidding. I mean, we had four contractors, one of which was, major contractors. McDonnell Douglas, later McDonnell Douglas, General Electric, and Eastman Kodak. Kodak was invisible. They didn't exist. And yet the program managed that. Of course, the program got canceled, but that was not because of that. I was marveled. I was marveled that the government could pull off what was right before my very eyes.
Tell them about your first visit to Kodak.
Yeah. My first, I was just telling Grim, my first visit to Rochester to Eastman Kodak, they said the standard things: you don't use your military ID, use your driver's license. And they said, stay in this hotel, and next door there's a little breakfast place. Go have breakfast at 7 o'clock. A red-headed guy is going to come in and sit down and have breakfast with you. Go with him. And that's a true story, and I did, and it turned out all right.
Any other surprises?
Well, a surprise, but not a surprise. The MOL program, for about the last year, but certainly the last half year of the program, it was really, really stumbling. It was having budget problems. It was having schedule problems. And there was a new administration. Nixon came in office. A new team came in. And they started questioning. Obviously, you had to ask all the same old questions. What are you doing? What did you do this for? So it's not a surprise. The way it was, the cancellation that was handled was really very surprising. One day we went to the office. I was actually on the Hill, involved with some testimony and classified. And next thing I know, somebody taps me on the shoulder and says the program got canceled. Mr. Chairman, may I have a word with you? Not a good day. So it was expected. I mean, after all, Vietnam War was raging. The Air Force was up to their eyeballs and in airplanes, flying things. This was an air war. Big air war. What all this astronaut stuff? Go away. And that was the mood of the country at that time. Yep.
Anyone else with a surprise they want to share?
I'd like to turn your question just a little bit. We've been here talking about what was a program that represented a massive attempt to do something different. And I think we've all enjoyed it, and we hope that you have as well. I'd like to get some understanding of you and your programs, if you don't mind. How many people are here still working at the Mother Church who are in this audience? Would you put your hands up? Not that.
You mean active duty or civil service?
Yeah, the Mother Church, I assume they still call Wright-Patterson the Mother Church. Yeah. How many are former people who have worked on challenges here at Wright-Pat and maybe are either contractors now or retired? Quite a few. How many are contractors who have previously or now are supported the Air Force mission as it's being conducted here and enabled here? Great. We're talking about the lessons that we're learning and we've learned from one program. But a good percentage of this audience could be telling us about the lessons that you have been learning and how you're applying them in important programs that are reaching out in the same way as this program reached out. And I think that for all of us, and you can obviously speak for yourself, would like to say thank you to all this group of people who are worked so hard over, I'm sure, a whole career here in this area. It was a proud moment for me when I had that opportunity to do that.
Okay, we're ready to move into the third phase of the evening, and that's to, in a very structured sort of way, announce that we're going to be releasing tonight and post it on the NRO webpage tomorrow this compendium of Dorian documents that have never been declassified before. I should point out that we have some number of these compendiums when you leave available for pickup. I've been told that we had a larger audience than anticipated and would one a compendium to the family. For those of you who don't get a copy and still want it, it will be available in PDF form on the NRO webpage. And the NRO links are on your program. At this point, I'd like to ask Ms. Patty Camarisi to come up here and join me. She's the chief of the NRO Information Review and Release Group at the NRO, and she and her staff were the ones who poured through many pages, some 22,000 pages, to make sure it could be declassified and available to you and others in the public. And I've asked her to say a few words about that and let you know the work that went through to produce this.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, my office is the Information Review and Release Group at the NRO, and we're responsible for handling all of the requests that come in from the public under, mandatory programs like the Freedom of Information Act, the Privacy Act, mandatory declassification and review programs. But one of our major programs is called Systematic Declassification Review, and this Dorian effort was one of those SDRs, we call them. And I'd like to introduce Scott Swisher, who was largely responsible for the coordination of this from start to finish. Declassification, review, and release is a very complicated process. And in this case, it took over a year to get all of the stakeholders involved, to get them to agree to declassification of additional material, and then to do the actual line-by-line review. I'd like to turn it over to Scott now so that he can say a few words about the effort and maybe thank a few of our stakeholders for their contributions. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Patty. I just wanted to start off by thanking our panel members. We discussed in very vague terms upstairs those few important items that we are still withholding from the general public regarding the Dorian part of the MOLE program. So I would thank you, gentlemen, for taking heed and skirting those issues with the public here tonight. We certainly appreciate that. So I just wanted to briefly mention what you'll find on the website, hopefully tomorrow morning, let's say around 8:30, but since we do work for the government, give us about an hour or so on either side of that, and we'll make sure that it's there. But we did undertake a large effort, about 20,000 plus pages of MOLE Dorian material, and that was about 852 documents, if I recall correctly. So it was not a trivial task for us to get that done. You'll find those as well, gentlemen. You may enjoy taking a trip down memory lane and seeing 282 pictures as well. I think some of them you are in, and many of them I think you'll get a chuckle out of as well. So please, when you get home tomorrow, take a look at them. And let us know what you think, if you would. So, where you can find those, if you have a program, on the back of your program, there are several links. If you're in the middle section here between the two lines, the last HTTP address there, which ends with declass/collections.html, that's where you'll find all of the declassified documents as well as the pictures. If you go to the link directly above that with the history/index.html, if you're not lucky enough to get a compendium, that's where you'll find the compendium sometime tomorrow in PDF form as well. So I wanted to make sure everybody knew where to find that information. The other thing I wanted to do, two more things real quickly. The other thing I wanted to do is thank some of our government partners who helped make this not only event but the declassification effort possible. And the first I wanted to thank was our internal NRO partners. As you can imagine, with such a large declassification effort, the declassification office wasn't the only part of the NRO that played a part in the process. So we certainly wanted to thank our NRO partners from back in Washington primarily. And also, we wanted to thank our other government partners, and there's one of them running around here tonight, the Air Force Declassification Office. They were a dream to work with throughout this entire process. Most of the information that they had was from the white world and was public knowledge, but they had some other stuff, and they were really a cooperative partner in helping us get through some of the Dorian documents. So we wanted to make sure we would thank that Air Force Declassification Office, as well as some of our industry partners that we work with. Aerospace Corporation, we wanted to make sure we acknowledge their help in this effort as well. There are 850-some documents that we went through, and they provided tens of those documents. So a large number of the collection came from Aerospace Corporation, as well as over 200 of the pictures came from Aerospace Corporation as well. Unfortunately, they had better record keeping back in those days than we did. So, and the other corporate partner we wanted to thank real quickly was CACI. They provided a lot of the SMEs, the subject matter experts, to review these documents. We won't mention the ages of those subject matter experts, but they certainly played a huge part in making this possible as well. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is Patty mentioned that we do a lot of discretionary release items at the NRO, and I wanted to provide 2 points of contact. There's a lot of expertise and knowledge out in this auditorium tonight. If you have an idea for something you would like to see the NRO do in the future regarding a discretionary release topic or program, certainly we meet several times a year to discuss these and down select and decide what we're going to do in the future. We'd certainly love to hear from you. If we can do it, and I stress the word can, we will try to do it as long as there's enough public interest. So a phone number that may be interesting for you to have to send those ideas to is 703-227-9326. I'll give it to you again, 703-227-9326. And then since we also do a number of different things in that office, there's an email address as well. It's simply FOIA@nro.mil. So that's FOIA@nro.mil. So thanks, everybody, for coming tonight.
Thank you. Two pieces of last business tonight. Dr. Outson edited the compendium, has an excellent introduction that I recommend you looking at. James and Patty are going to present a signed copy to each of the panelists, a signed copy of the compendium that has the signature of each of the panelists as well as the editor. I am also going to present the panelists with a commemorative coin from our NRO Directorate. And when we finish that, the General would like to come up and, on behalf of the museum, make a presentation.